The first African American residents of Cleveland Heights arrived before the village formed and lived in some of the 30-odd houses built in the Euclid Heights allotment around the turn of the 20th century. 15 black servants lived in 5 mansions on or near the Overlook in Euclid Heights in 1900. Euclid Heights developer Patrick Calhoun employed 7 of them. Calhoun, his wife Sally, and their 8 children lived in an 1896 mansion on Edge Hill Road, along with Calhoun's secretary and 7 African-American servants. Jane Robinson, a 72-year-old widowed servant, was formerly enslaved on John C. Calhoun's Fort Hill plantation in Clemson, South Carolina, where she had worked as a maid to Calhoun's wife, Floride. Robinson's 8 grandchildren accompanied Patrick and Sally Calhoun to Cleveland, and as of 1900, Priest Robinson served as their butler and Ella and Mary Robinson as child nurses. 10 years later, census enumerators found 35 black or mulatto residents in the 7-year-old village of Cleveland Heights. They comprised 1.2% of the village's population at the time, the highest proportion until the 1960s. 3/4 of them were servants in private homes, mostly in Euclid Heights. 2 were servants at the Euclid Club, which was Cleveland's second oldest golf club, and another 7 men worked as teamsters or stable hands in a paving contractor's encampment on Mayfield Road. In 1920, in the midst of the Great Migration, the census counted 153 African Americans in Cleveland Heights. More than 80% of them were live-in servants or their dependents. Most lived and worked in single-family homes, although the initial development of apartment buildings between Coventry and Cedar Fairmount explains why about 40% of African Americans in the village lived and worked in apartments. In 1930, almost 70% of the 571 African Americans residing in Cleveland Heights were live-in servants. 10 years later, 366 of 476 blacks in the city were live-in servants. A considerable number of new employers of live-in servants were Jewish residents who had participated in a large-scale movement of the Jewish community out of Glenville in Cleveland to Cleveland Heights. Live-in domestic work was the least desirable living arrangement for many African Americans. Among the challenges they faced were employers' racial fears, accusations of wrongdoing, and sometimes outright abuses, including one case of 2 young black women brought from a Cleveland Heights lumber baron's Alabama mill to his Wellington Road home and forced into peonage in 1937. But the most common challenges were simply living under the watchful eye of their employer at all times, and in many cases having to live apart from their families. Black families with children were exceedingly rare in Heights homes. In 1920, there was only one. Kenyon Painter's chauffeur, George Bundy, lived with his wife and teenage daughter. 10 years later, only 3 families with children lived together while working in Cleveland Heights homes. For African Americans who were resident apartment building custodians, their arrangement offered a little more autonomy. Most occupied less desirable basement units for which they paid partial rent and worked long hours at menial work. The 1920 census found only 5 black janitors with 9 dependents. By 1930, thanks to the apartment boom, 166 African Americans, or almost 30%, lived in households supported at least partially by one on-site custodial worker. Out of 29 male janitor-headed households, the man was the only employed person in 23 of them. Although it was certainly not an easy life, building custodians secured a degree of independent living seldom seen in white-owned homes, in part because they could often rely on multiple sources of income or accept lodgers. Perhaps some could escape the watchful and insistent presence of their employers and carve out places of their own, to quote the title of Andrew Weiss's book on black suburbanization. Exceedingly rare were African Americans who managed to secure apartments in Cleveland Heights independently of domestic service. I'll share one of the 3 examples that I found from the 1940 census, the Lee family. Everett Lee had worked as a stock clerk for a wholesale druggist and as a barber in his hometown of Wheeling, West Virginia, before migrating to Cleveland with his wife Mamie and his 2 sons in 1927. By 1935, he obtained his first government job as the assistant manager in a Treasury Department office with 85 white employees, which enabled the family to move from Cedar Central to Glenville. In the late 1930s, he managed the finance department for the Outhwaite Homes public housing project and would go on to work for the U.S. War Department during World War II. After their sons had graduated from Glenville High School, the Lees moved in 1938 to the Attleboro, a four-suiter at 2096 Surrey Road. It's possible that they were attracted to Cleveland Heights because, as musicologist Carol Oja has written, their older son Everett Jr. was an accomplished violinist who was studying at the Cleveland Institute of Music with Joseph Fuchs, who lived a block away in an Art Deco building called the Braverman-Brantley Apartments on Euclid Heights Boulevard. The relationships Everett Jr. forged with members of the Cleveland Orchestra, coupled with his father's ease and white-dominated work settings, may have enabled the Lees to feel more comfortable and confident lifting the Ivory Curtain. Homeowners had the possibility of the greatest independence, but also the burden of incurring white anger. As was true more broadly, whites tended to embrace blacks' presence in servile roles, but could not stand the thought of black homeowners as neighbors or equals. I found 10 African American individuals or families that acquired building lots or houses in Cleveland Heights between 1923 and 1957. 5 of them suffered bombing or arson attacks, and a 6th had her partially built home torn down by angry whites. However, 4 do not appear to have been attacked. Ultimately, regardless of their reception by the largely white community, 8 black families succeeded in building or buying and then occupying homes in Cleveland Heights. 6 of these 8 household heads were physicians. The first black homeowners in Cleveland Heights, whose presence has eluded all historical attention, were Alfred and Mamie Copes. Alfred Copes' father, Fenderson Copes, was born into slavery in New Bern, North Carolina, and migrated in the 1860s to Oberlin, Ohio, where Alfred was born and raised. In 1915, Alfred moved to Cleveland and married Mamie Yates, originally from Springfield, Ohio. In 1923, the Copes acquired a lot at 2498 Princeton Road in the Shaker Lake subdivision off of Fairmount Boulevard. Perhaps Copes was able to avoid the obstacle of securing a construction loan because he was a long-established builder. The knowledge of plans for, and later the presence of, the Canterbury School across the street may have given the Copes some comfort and protection. The couple lived there without any documented incident for 17 years until the builder's construction of a nearby home for his sister prompted white backlash, as I'll explain shortly. The second African-American home acquisition in Cleveland Heights was that by Dr. Robert T. Wise and his wife Lula. Born in Mart, Texas in 1891, Wise graduated from Meharry Medical College in Nashville in 1918 and moved to Cleveland to start his medical practice. He married Lula, also a Texas native, 4 years later, and they lived in Huff 3 decades before blacks began to move there in large numbers. By 1927, they had made up their minds to move to Cleveland Heights, specifically to a large brick home at 3075 Washington Boulevard. The Wises worked through a Jewish intermediary, Saul Greenberg, to buy the house. An oral history with Stanley Adelstein, whose family lived a few houses away, strongly suggests that the Wises delayed moving in, taking a long view in their pursuit of upward mobility. They may also have minimized time outdoors and carefully planned their arrivals and departures. Ultimately, however, they could not stave off white anger. Adelstein recalled, quote, "I regret very much that the people who were living on Washington Boulevard were so upset at the thought of a black family becoming a neighbor of theirs that when they learned of the fact, the neighbors put together enough money and they had someone to plant an explosive. I remember, after the bombing occurred, we rushed out into the street, and the black family consisted of a physician and his wife, and the wife kept saying to the police, 'I don't know why this happened. I will never understand why this happened.' They moved in, of course, and lived there for many, many years, and they were a very fine addition to the neighborhood." Soon after the Wises, newlyweds Alonzo and Henrietta Wright began the arduous process of buying a home at 2985 Hampshire Road. Wright was born in 1898 in Fayetteville, Tennessee, and raised in a one-room shack by his widowed laundress mother. They moved into Cleveland in 1912. Later, in the 1920s, when Wright was working as a downtown garage attendant, he met the former president of Ohio, who offered him a job, and soon Wright was turning a money-losing service station into a national success story through his innovation of offering free windshield washing. His fortunes rising, Wright married Henrietta Cheeks, who was a schoolteacher from Virginia, in 1929. That summer, the Wrights orchestrated a clandestine home purchase in Cleveland Heights. The elaborate plot involved intermediaries Charles and Ethel Obey, who would serve in their stead to buy Hermina Keller's Hampshire Road house and then transfer it to the Wrights. I documented a very labyrinthine plot that involved several different transfers that's a little too complicated to try to explain here. But suffice it to say that this was a roughly 2-year process that finally resulted in the Wrights obtaining clear title by May 1931. As historian Marion Morton has written, someone then bombed the Wrights' home, but like the Wises, the Wrights were determined to stay. Their son Gordon attended the Heights public school system through his junior year at Heights High, when they moved in 1947 to a farm in Geauga County. 2 more physicians and their wives occupied new Heights homes in the early 1930s as well. Dr. Armin and Louise Evans had bought an empty lot at 3507 Meadowbrook Boulevard in 1925, a couple of years before any other houses were built on that street, while Dr. Hardy F. Harris and his wife Endor purchased a house down the street at 3544. The Evans left their lot unbuilt for 6 years, possibly because they were saving money, and possibly also because they were watching how the subdivision developed. In 1931, they transferred their lot to Clarence Mack, who obtained a permit and built the house, which he in turn transferred to Cornelia Nickens. Cornelia Nickens was Dr. Evans' mother. Nickens, who continued to live in Cedar Central, held title to the Meadowbrook home, enabling the Evans to claim renter status when needed until they acquired the deed for good in 1944. Dr. Hardy F. Harris, who was born in Wetumpka, Alabama in 1886, earned his medical degree from Meharry Medical College in 1905 and practiced in Anniston, where he met and married Endor, who was a native of Mississippi. Then the couple moved up to Buffalo, New York, before resettling finally in Cleveland, starting in the Cedar Central area in 1924. From there, they moved to Cleveland Heights 6 years later, working through a pair of intermediaries to buy their home. The details of their suburban experience are quite elusive. They ended up returning to Cedar Central after only 5 years, which suggests, at the least, that living in Cleveland Heights may have been socially isolating for them. In contrast, the Evans family managed to stay in Cleveland Heights, although the fact that they had no new neighbors on their block for the next 8 years suggests that their presence may have deterred construction on surrounding lots. Nevertheless, the Evans family apparently avoided outright hostility, and they sent their daughters Gwendolyn and Barbara Ann through the Heights schools, where they graduated in 1944 and 1946, respectively. The home then stayed in the family until Louise's death in 1982. The next black homeowners in Cleveland Heights were Dr. Luther and Myrtle Baumgardner. He was born in Wedgefield, South Carolina in 1896. He attended Howard University and then went into medical practice in Columbia, South Carolina in 1921. 3 years later, he migrated to Cleveland, where he married Myrtle Robinson, who had grown up in Eastern Huff and then in East Cleveland. The Robinsons had a light complexion, and as the Great Migration brought about a hardening of the color line, they chose to change their classification in the census from black to white between 1910 and 1920. And then when Luther and Myrtle wed, they listed themselves as white in the 1930 census while living in what was still considered an all-white suburb, East Cleveland. In 1937, the Baumgardners learned of a house listing at 1504 Wilmar Road in Cleveland Heights, just off Mayfield Road. And despite claiming whiteness to the census taker 7 years earlier, they followed the well-worn path of enlisting white intermediaries to buy on their behalf. Remaining cautious, the couple delayed moving into their new house until August 1938, probably waiting until after their second daughter Jane was born. 5 nights later, the Baumgardner's windows shattered in unison with a blast as Dr. Baumgardner was tucking baby Jane into bed. A stick of dynamite had blown a huge crater in the Baumgardner's front lawn. When asked by a reporter to comment, Mayor Frank Kane said only that he was waiting to hear the facts, and he would talk with the police the next morning. An incredulous reporter from the Call and Post responded caustically, quote, "We hear much about law and order in these residential suburbs that surround Cleveland, yet at times they appear just as full of lawless elements as the city of Cleveland, which they like to thumb their noses at," end quote. Despite the challenge they faced, the Baumgardners became long-standing Heights citizens, sending their 2 girls through the Heights schools and remaining on Wilmar Road until Dr. Baumgardner died in 1976. After the Baumgardners refused to be forced out, a pair of more serious incidents unfolded in 1939 when African Americans sought to build on lots where the Evans resided and only several blocks north of where the Copes lived. The purchasers were related to each other and to the Copes, so it seems likely that their decisions to locate in Cleveland Heights were influenced by the Copes and probably the Evans' nearby presence as well. In 1936, Effie Dixon, Mamie Copes' sister, bought a lot on North Cliff Road, 1 block north of Meadowbrook, and 2 years later, Effie Baxter, Alfred Copes' sister, did the same on Meadowbrook at Queenston Road. If these newcomers succeeded, the small subdivision would have seen its black households triple in number in a short time. But it seems that whites in the area were determined to hold the line based on what followed. Baxter was born Effie Yates in 1889 in Springfield and grew up in Cleveland. In 1924, she married Edgar Dixon, who was a clerk in a local law firm, and the couple rented an apartment in Cedar Central. After the Dixons bought their lot at 3552 Northcliffe, they received a letter from Second Federal Savings and Loan inviting them to apply for a construction loan. When the Dixons appeared at the bank, they were told it was the bank's policy not to loan to people of color seeking homes in white neighborhoods. Eventually, the Dixons followed a different path. In January 1939, they contracted with a Jewish-owned building firm and days later turned to a white friend named Joseph Addo, who went to Second Federal and succeeded in getting a loan himself with a plan to transfer the title to the property back to the Dixons once the home was completed. Throughout the construction, the Dixons contented themselves with the occasional drive past the construction site, never daring to stop. One day in late May, they could no longer contain their eagerness, and so they stopped and were promptly spotted by white neighbors. Then, in a 2-week period in June, some person or persons entered the house 3 times, flooding it, starting a fire, and finally placing a crude bomb inside that caused extensive damage. Meanwhile, the Cleveland Heights city solicitor, under intense pressure from aggrieved white residents nearby, contacted Second Federal and urged the bank to ask Dixon to abandon the property. Whether to shore up the color line or merely to safeguard its investment, as it would claim in court, Second Federal allegedly coerced Addo to surrender the deed. The bank also refused to refund the money that the Dixons had invested in the lot, suggesting instead that it would complete the house, offer it for sale, and give the Dixons any profits left after recovering its own investment first. The Dixons refused. As a result, Dixon's employer gave him an ultimatum: accept Second Federal's offer or be fired. Dixon refused and was fired. Second Federal then moved to foreclose on the Dixons' property and to seek a judgment against Addo and the Dixons for the damage caused by the attacks. The Dixons filed a counterclaim charging that Second Federal, having discovered the Dixons' subterfuge, confiscated their property, thereby violating their constitutional and civil rights. By involving Addo, the Dixons initially became beneficiaries of his whiteness, but the resulting construction then provoked white sabotage. This catalyzed a chain reaction that prompted foreclosure proceedings and exposed the Dixons to loss. When the case came to trial in February 1940, the judge focused on Second Federal's losses rather than the much more grievous misfortunes that its refusal to loan to the Dixons had precipitated. Squashing any hopes of challenging discriminatory practices that made white intermediaries necessary conduits for black home buying in the first place, the judge ruled that Addo was in default and that Effie Dixon, as the effective owner, must pay all amounts owed plus court costs or face foreclosure and sheriff's sale of the damaged property. The Dixons forfeited their dream home and retreated to a home that they bought in Glenville as a result. In the meantime, Effie's brother-in-law, Alfred Copes, was embroiled in another controversy just a block to the west. Copes' sister, Effie Baxter, had bought a lot in 1938 at 3481 Meadowbrook, just 6 houses west of where Dr. Evans' family resided. The property drew white neighbors' ire when Copes began constructing a new home for his sister in 1939. While Joseph Addo was obtaining a permit to build the Dixons' house, whites quote-unquote condemned the Baxter house and presumably warned Copes to halt its construction. In the spring of 1940, possibly after attempts to resume construction, irate whites tore down the incomplete house, precipitating another court battle. In what was hardly a coincidence, Alfred and Mamie Copes abandoned their Princeton Road home after 17 years and rented in Mount Pleasant before buying in Glenville. In Effie Baxter v. City of Cleveland Heights et al., a case heard in 1941 by the U.S. District Court, Baxter alleged that the city manager and building inspector, along with a private citizen, had conspired to destroy her property. But the judge ruled in the city's favor, and so she sold her lot to a white man who rebuilt the house. So it was that Dr. and Mrs. Armin Evans ended up being the only African-American family in the southeastern quadrant of Cleveland Heights prior to the 1960s. It would be nearly 10 years before the next known attempt by a black family to buy in Cleveland Heights. In the summer of 1949, Dr. Jesse Wallace and his wife, Lorena, acquired a 4,600-square-foot tile-roofed brick house at 2737 Edge Hill Road. The Wallaces secured the assistance of one Martin G. Brown, who represented himself as the buyer, and then deeded the house back to the doctor and his wife 6 months later. Jesse Wallace was born in Calvert, Texas in 1890 and earned a medical degree, like some others we've discussed, from Meharry Medical College. He began his practice in Texas, where he met his future wife, Lorena Phillips, a schoolteacher, and the couple moved to Cleveland in the 1920s and bought a home in Glenville. There they spent the next 2 decades as he built his medical practice. Dr. Wallace lived there without any known incident in Cleveland Heights until 1969 when he died, and Lorena continued to live in the home until she also died in 1981. So how did the Wallaces avoid hostility? Perhaps the brick alley, Mornington Lane, which sloped past the Wallaces' side driveway down to Euclid Heights Boulevard, permitted the family to make their comings and goings as invisible as possible. Or they may have benefited from the fact that no blacks had apparently attempted to buy in Cleveland Heights for the previous decade. Or perhaps on this more affluent street, the neighbors simply felt less threatened, or were maybe more reluctant to call negative attention to their street by taking violent action. The last of the 8 black homeowning families who arrived in Cleveland Heights before 1960 was that of Dr. Emerald B. Spencer, an Alabama native, and his wife Marie Spencer, originally from Urbana, Ohio. Born in 1895, E.B. Spencer studied medicine at Howard University and earned his M.D. in 1925. The Spencers moved to an apartment in Mount Pleasant, then purchased their first home in Glenville. Although Dr. Spencer had earned a medical degree and his wife had graduated from college, Their color necessitated the help of a white intermediary to be the first blacks to buy on a street where the several nearest homeowners only had between a grade school and high school education. 4 years later, Alfred and Mamie Copes moved across the street, directly across from the Spencers, and it seems certain that the two couples became acquainted, if they weren't already, and that the Copes related the experiences that they had had in Cleveland Heights. Both couples also shared another experience. They had moved from Mount Pleasant to Glenville, but otherwise they were on different paths. The Copes had pioneered black homeownership in Cleveland Heights, but had never won full acceptance despite 17 years as model citizens. The Spencers' own experience in the Heights was still on the horizon. In 1957, the Spencers sold the Glenville home that they occupied, turning again a second time to white intermediaries to purchase a 3,000 square foot brick home at 2473 Edge Hill Road. Soon after they moved in, the Spencers suffered the first in a series of menacing incidents when someone slashed 2 tires on their car. Over the next 3 months, additional incidents kept them on edge. An unknown person or persons hurled a kerosene bomb that landed harmlessly outside the home. They tore up plants in their garden, and someone then lobbed a stench bomb through the Spencers' living room window. The Cleveland Heights police dismissed these acts as the likely work of unruly juveniles, but the harassment just continued, including having dirt dumped on their driveway and someone who was driving a hearse past the house every night. The mayor at the time, Ken Nash, insinuated that the Spencers and perhaps black civil rights activists were making unreasonable demands of his police department. He said they would get no more protection than any other citizens, and he lamented that in spite of keeping their property nice, the Spencers had resorted to subterfuge to get it in the first place. As with the Dixons, the Spencers were blamed for daring to obtain their civil rights by breaking the rules. The African-American presence in Cleveland Heights did not necessarily translate into an African-American community. First, although blacks numbered 571 in 1930, they comprised only 1% of the suburb's population, little different from the 30 years before or after 1930. Second, few stayed here long. Their presence diffused and precarious, African Americans in Cleveland Heights inhabited social worlds fragmented by class and geography. The vast majority of domestic service workers and spouses with industrial jobs generally worked long hours, leaving scarce time for social interaction. In addition, their daily lives had little in common with the fortunate few homeowners. Having a Cleveland Heights address did little to reorient black residents from the handful of Cleveland neighborhoods that contained the majority of the stores, restaurants, night spots, religious institutions, and fraternal organizations that helped to nurture black communities. Nevertheless, African American homeowners forged a sense of community rooted in their membership in professional associations and social organizations, and in the social gatherings they held in each other's homes. The most popular gathering place seems to have been the Wise's home on Washington Boulevard. And the fact that 6 of 8 black men who owned homes in Cleveland Heights were physicians also provided professional and personal linkages. Specifically, Drs. Wise and Wallace were both native Texans, both graduates of Meharry Medical College in 1918 and 19, respectively, and both migrated to Cleveland in the early to mid-1920s. Drs. Baumgardner and Evans both interned around 1920 at Freedman's Hospital in Washington, D.C., and Myrtle Baumgardner was Barbara Ann Evans' godmother. As previously mentioned, Alfred and Mamie Copes were connected to Effie Baxter and Edgar and Effie Dixon through blood or marriage, and surely they empathized with each other's achievements and hardships in their respective struggles, either to retain or attain suburban homeownership. There was also some degree of familiarity between the physicians' families and the others who lived in Cleveland Heights, with some attending the same social gatherings. And everyone seemed to know Alonzo and Henrietta Wright. Although their perseverance did not lift the Ivory Curtain on its own, Cleveland Heights residency paid off to some extent for their children. For those who could overcome the obstacles in their way, Their children had the opportunity for a superior education in a school system that won national accolades in the mid-20th century. At least 12 African Americans attended Heights High between 1930 and 1960. The earliest may have been Dorothy Orms, who graduated in the Cleveland Heights High School class of 1932. The daughter of apartment building custodian Barney Orms and his wife Parthenia, she lived at 2517 Overlook Road, just one block from where the formerly enslaved Jane Robinson toiled for Patrick Calhoun 30 years earlier. One pines for opportunities lost decades ago to conduct oral histories to help fill gaps that are part of researching African Americans in Cleveland Heights. The accomplishment of lifting the Ivory Curtain by buying and holding on to a suburban house long enough to make it a home deserves much more investigation than the scant record allows. Without the recovery of their stories, incomplete though they may be, the history of Cleveland Heights would remain skewed heavily toward quote-unquote great white men, and its history of integration would also emerge only with the second generation of black pioneers in the 1960s.